I used to work at Papa John's. One thing I found at Papa John's was, besides the pizza's better than Domino's, for sure. Domino's is from Satan. Papa John's is amazing. Pizza Hut's kind of in the middle right here, but we don't have a Pizza Hut nearby, so that's what it is. But one thing at Papa John's I've learned is it's a little bit sketchy there. We'll just say at the Papa John's I was at in Kansas City, they would take care of making up the drugs in the back, and they would do the drugs out front. Like in the middle of shift and everything.
Seriously?
100%. We had some who would take 2-hour smoke breaks. We would have some that would leave in the middle of the dinner rush. It was kind of a sketchy situation. We had multiple kidnappings happen in front of the store. We had someone get shot. Yeah, it was pretty crazy. So very not ideal work environment, right? And I was in this place and I was the only professing believer here. And I had to ask the question, how can I share Jesus with these people, right? How can I share Jesus with these who are struggling, these who have real life situations? Usually I don't just go up to them and say, hey, you know, I want you to know about the 6 points of the gospel. Can I share with you the gospel? They're like, dude, get away from me. Right? I don't want to hear about that. It was hard to kind of have that talk, yeah, exactly, with them. But what if I could tell you that there is one thing you can do to bring any conversation? What would you say? I could bring any conversation ultimately back to God. That doesn't mean we should in every situation, because sometimes it doesn't make the most sense to be able to do this, but in any circumstance, we can take anything that they're interested in and bring it back to God. For example, anytime someone in some kind of context says, hey, we need to fight for equality, right? We need to fight for, making sure that these things are right. Or if someone's like talking about politics, they're like, hey, listen, love is love. Or hey, we need to make sure we fight for social justice. Or even if you want to get into the really, controversial stuff, they'll say things like trans rights are human rights, or even something as simple as like, hey, listen, I'm just sending good vibes. Something happens, just sending good vibes your way, right? All of these things have something in common. In contrast, you see people say things like this. You want to control women. We're having conversations about abortion or about homosexuality or anything like that, transgenderism. Or Christians are hypocrites, or your view is repressive, or this person, famous person, is a racist. I even saw someone who came to the Papa John's had a shirt that said, kill transphobes, right?
What's that?
Doesn't matter. Point being, in each of these situations, what do we see here? What are all these things? Sam?
Sin.
These things are all things that the viewer sees as bad. By contrast, what are these things?
Good.
What the viewer sees as good, right? Not just now, when the viewer says these things, we need to fight for equality. Are they saying, it is my preference that we fight for equality? Is that what they're saying? It doesn't matter, it's just my preference, like ice cream. I like vanilla. You might not like equality, but I do. Is that what they're saying? No. By contrast, what if they say something like this? Are they saying, well, I don't like it when Christians act this way, but it doesn't really matter. Murder, hypocrisy, chocolate ice cream, it's all basically the same thing. It's just a preference, right? Is that what they're saying? No, they're saying these are actually bad, regardless of what people think. You see, whenever any kind of important issue is brought up, so whether it be in a Papa John's, in the back of a Papa John's as they're rolling pot, or whether it is in a church setting, in a youth group, whenever we're talking about something important and we say that something should be this way or something shouldn't be this way, what we're saying is there is some kind of ought in this world. There's some kind of things should be this way. The number one argument against Christianity is what's called the problem of evil. The idea that because there's so much evil in this world, because there's such a thing as wrong, there's such a thing as suffering, as things ought not to be. And God's all powerful, so how can these two things work together? If God is really all powerful, why wouldn't he stop all this stuff? That's the biggest argument against Christianity. But I want you to understand something. That argument betrays a reality that we all recognize when we don't have our defenses up, and that there is actually something wrong with this world. Even people who hate Christianity to the highest, they'll still say things like this. They're saying, this controlling women is actually wrong. Not just not preference, but actually wrong. It is an evil. Hypocrisy is actually wrong. Not just not my preference, it is actually wrong for everybody. Regardless of what you think, it is actually wrong. That's the view. We all believe in actual ought-nots and ought-tos. And the question is, since we all believe in these things, we disagree sometimes what those things are, but we believe there is such a thing as those things, we have to ask the question, where do we get ought and ought-nots? Where do we get the standard by which we judge good and evil? People who are not Christians have come up with different explanations for these things, right? So the first explanation is what's called individual right and wrong, individual morality. The idea is this: I have my beliefs, and it determines whatever is right for me, but it might not be right for you. So for example, for the Jew, it's wrong to eat pork, but for the non-Jew, it's okay to eat pork. So everything is relative to the person. But then you had to apply what I call the Hitler test. Can you apply the standard for right and wrong to Hitler? Hitler thought, hey, it's cool for me to kill 6 million people. Hey, it might not be right for me, but it's right for you, Is that all right? Of course not. It is faulty to ground right and wrong. It is faulty to ground right and wrong in individual preference, an individual feeling of what we think is right for us. So when we say things are actually right or actually wrong, we fail when we say, well, it's just a matter of person to person. Others have said, well, no, it's not just a person. Culture determines right or wrong. Whatever our culture thinks, that's what's right and that's what's wrong. Let's apply the Hitler test again. What about the Nazi culture?
What's that?
The Nazis were the bad guys in World War II. What about the Nazi culture? Their culture thought it's perfectly fine to do all these evil things. Does that mean it's fine?
No. Good gosh.
So no, absolutely not. Cultural morality is not a sufficient standard for oughts and ought not. We also run into the problem of what's called the reformer's dilemma. How many of you guys have heard of the phrase progressive before? Right? In politics, it's typically you have the conservatives and the progressives, right? Now, understand this. Those who are progressive, what they believe is that we need to progress away from where we currently are towards something they would consider to be greater, right? So society is not where it needs to be now, so we need to make it different to make it better, right? So they're saying, well, you're not accepting of, say, trans people, so you're a transphobe, and we need to change society to do what's right and wrong. But here's the thing. If culture is what determines right or wrong, then by definition, anyone trying to change society is morally wrong. If culture is what determines what's right or wrong, that means that anyone trying to change the culture is wrong by definition. Martin Luther King Jr., when he tried to change segregation, was morally wrong. William Wilberforce, trying to abolish slavery, because the culture was like slavery is good, morally wrong by definition. That's a problem. Yes?
But wasn't Martin Luther King Jr. a good person?
That's the reality here. Notice this. If you accept cultural morality, all these things, every time we try to change culture, we're wrong. Therefore, we can't ground morality in culture. You see this? So those people were not actually wrong. Okay? Well, maybe not culture. Maybe it's just the global morality, just the global culture. Maybe individual cultures get it wrong sometimes, but maybe we can ground right and wrong in just what everyone in the entire world says. Well, let's apply the Hitler test.
Oh, God.
What if the Nazis won World War II and they successfully made themselves the rulers of the whole world? Would that mean that what they believed was then becomes right?
No, it's morally wrong.
No, absolutely not. What about the global slave trade? Hey, the globe thought it was fine. Doesn't that mean it's okay? Of course not. Of course not. Global morality is an insufficient explanation for objective right and wrong that we all believe in. Okay, well, what about, maybe it's not just the globe, maybe it's just whatever people, regardless of what people think, whatever is the well-being of people, whatever brings human flourishing the most, maybe that's what's right or wrong, right? Whatever is good for every single person, period. Well, let me ask you this. When we're fighting World War II, Nazi test, when we're fighting World War II, when an Allied soldier shot a Nazi to protect the people from invasion, the people they're attacking, is that for that individual Nazi's well-being? No. What about when we imprison criminals, people who are psychopaths or terrorists who want to kill thousands of people? Is that for that individual person's well-being? No. We can't get right and wrong simply from what is for the well-being of every individual person. Well, what about the well-being just for people in general, even if it's not for each individual's well-being? Maybe that's where we can get right and wrong from, right? Let's do the Nazi test again, the Hitler test. What would happen? What did the Nazis want to do? Do you guys know what the goal of the Nazi regime was? The Third Reich? Yes.
Want to destroy Hitler?
The Nazis, those are the bad guys, the ones who serve Hitler. What was their goal?
They wanted to eradicate all the Jews from Europe
Right, and why?
because they thought they were the cause of all evil.
Cause of evil, right? What else do they want to do to the disabled?
Kill them.
They wanted an Aryan race, which was just their single race, Germans, and they wanted every other minority eliminated.
Right. They wanted those who they thought were inferior, those who were genetically inferior, to be eliminated so they could come up with the Superman, what they called the Übermensch. They wanted the superior race. They wanted like, hey, what if every man were 6'3" and super jacked? What if everyone was perfectly have health, exactly the way that's what they're looking for? And let me ask you, would those things be better for each individual's like good? Would that be better for humanity if everyone was super healthy and super yeah, of course it'd be really good. But let me ask you this. So this is the line of reasoning. It's called eugenics. This is their line of reasoning. Well, who cares if I kill a couple 100 million for the sake of the next 10,000 years, the next couple 100 trillion? Who cares? For the individuals, so long as we're doing what's good for society as a whole.
That's still wrong.
It still fails. In the middle of COVID, we actually got, towards the beginning actually, we got reports that Kim Jong-un were shooting people who had COVID to prevent the spread.
What?
Yep, they're like, hey, you're contagious, bam.
Okay, that's just pure stupid.
But here's the thing. If all we care about is the well-being of the maximum number of people, we're preventing people from dying from COVID, so we'll just shoot them and then no more contagion.
It's just stupid.
Do you see the problem here? When you try to say, well, morality comes from just the general well-being of the public, you end up calling certain things right that we know are wrong and certain things wrong that we know are right. Even that does not account for where we get objective right and wrong, that we all at the very beginning agreed is the case. Well, maybe not flourishing, maybe. This is the closest thing I have ever heard to a good outside of God's source for morality. What about moral Platonism? Like, what the heck does that mean, right? Moral Platonism. I'll explain that. So moral Platonism is a belief that, hey, listen, how many of you guys are familiar with Plato, the philosopher? A few of you guys? Like 1, 2, 3, 4? A few of you guys, okay. Plato was a great philosopher back in the time of the ancient Greeks. And Plato had a view that certain things existed in the immaterial world that were the perfect form of how things are today. So for example, how do we know something is a chair? Plato would say, well, there is some immaterial form of a chair by which we judge chairness. Right? It's not super important to understand, but notice, here's what I'm pointing out here. Moral Platonism says there exists out there right and wrong in some immaterial way Like Saturn exists out there in some way. It just exists inexplicably. And that's where right and wrong come from. But here's the problem. Why should we care what Saturn wants? Why should we care? Who cares if we're in an alignment with Saturn? Who cares? Suppose there is such a thing as right and wrong out there. Who cares? Why does it matter to us if it just exists out there? You might be able to get what this is, for those of you guys who are super nerds here, you might be able to get with moral Platonism objective moral values. But you cannot with moral Platonism get objective moral duties or obligations. Something existing out there doesn't really matter. There has to be something that says, and you are obligated to do what that thing says, to align yourself with that thing. Just existing does not require obligation. You need something that says, you must be obligated. Well, what then would be a good explanation for these objective right and wrongs? Here's what this moral standard must be, and I use the acronym TAP, all right? First, for something to be the standard for all right and wrong, something has to be this. One, it has to be transcendent. What the heck does that mean? Transcendent, if you guys remember from the first lesson we had here, is to exist across all. This thing, whatever is the standard for right and wrong, must have existed at least for all of humanity. Imagine this. Imagine if I'm the standard for right and wrong. I was born in 1998. Do you know what that means? It's not wrong to kill before 1998. If I did not exist, and I'm the standard for it, then there's no standard, in which case you can do whatever you want. And when I die, there would be no standard after that either. In order for there to be a standard for right and wrong, this standard must exist at the very least for all of humanity. Second, this thing must be authoritative. Remember we talked about moral Platonism? For something to be a standard, it must require something of us. It can't just exist out there. In order for us to be obligated to obey it, it has to be our authority. At the end of the day, imagine if I were to tell you, hey, you are not allowed to go more than 10 miles per hour on the road. Would you be obligated to obey me? No, because I'm not your authority when it comes to the speed limit.
You're not the street cop.
But if the government were to tell you to install a new street sign that said no more than 10 miles per hour, it'd be annoying, but they could actually pull you over for it. Do you see the difference? One has the authority to give you an ought, the other does not. And then finally, this thing must be personal. Why personal? Imagine a thing that is your authority. Just put something in your mind. Can that thing be anything other than a person? Imagine this. Imagine if I said, hey, listen, I'm not allowed to attack you because this stand requires it of me. How dumb would that be? If I were to say, well, sorry, I'm not allowed to go over 10 miles per hour because there's an asteroid out there. You're like, how does that follow? It doesn't. The only thing that can be a legitimate authority from what we see around us are something personal. So friends, what do you get when you combine a transcendent authoritative person? You don't have to call that God, but I will say that is a very strange form of atheism to affirm that sort of a being exists. Now, that's a very short explanation of what we call moral argument for God's existence. So let me recap here. If we say there is such a thing as actual evil, not just a not my preference, then there must be such a thing as good. Because evil is saying it's ought not, and good is ought to. If there's such a thing as good and evil, then there must be some standard by which we get the ought and ought not. How do you get that standard? It has to be transcendent, authoritative, and personal. And that's God. That's the definition of God. And so when someone says, I can't believe in God because of suffering in this world, because of evil, this suffering is it ought not to happen. In order to say that, you have to believe in God, or you're not logically consistent. Now, I will say this. Does that make it easy when we go through suffering? No. It's not easy. But we need to have answers for our minds before we can get into the deep healing for our hearts. If I were to say to you, yeah, imagine if a terrorist were about to come in here and we knew there's no escape in 10 minutes. We're going to blow us all up. And I said to you, it's going to be okay, but it's a lie. Would that be comforting?
No.
No, of course not. Not unless you're deluded. We need to believe what is true, even if it is hard, so that we can learn to accept those truths and we can live in reality. And so, in that situation where the terrorist is coming, the way that you can have the most peace is to accept that and to prepare yourself for the life to come. And to say, I know where I'm going when I die. Not to delude yourself into believing a helpful fantasy. The fact of the matter is, evil requires God to exist. Because God is the only potential source that is both transcendent, authoritative, and personal. So, with that, any questions? Yes?
How does this tie into like personal conviction between each believer?
Absolutely. So, I know what you're getting at, but for everyone else, can you kind of explain a little more? Why is that a big deal? Why is that a big deal about personal convictions?
Well, because like there's the like fundamentals right and wrong, but then I think between like each person, like
Disagreement.
not like like drinking alcohol is not a sin, right? Being drunk is, but what if I have a friend who drinks in their free time, but then I think it's like
Sin.
wrong to
Yeah.
do so? Like not a sin, but just like personal, like me, I decide not to do that. So like, I don't know, just like if I think that's wrong, but they think that's okay, like.
Absolutely. So when I say there's such a thing as objective, actual right and wrong, I'm not saying it's always easy to tell which fits in the category of right and which fits in the category of wrong. Sometimes it's hard to tell. So imagine if I were to have a giant animal out there, right?
Okay.
And he was my pet, I had him out there. He exists out there. Can you see him through this wall? No. Our ability to figure out what is right and what is wrong does not change the fact that there is such a thing as right and wrong. Does that make sense? For those of you guys who are super nerds, how we know is what's called epistemology. What actually is, regardless of whether we know it or not, is called ontology. They're two separate things. We all agree that there is such a thing as ought and ought not. If for nothing else we realize that one ought not to torture babies for fun. Like, it's obvious. People on the progressive side would say, you ought not to, well, even really anyone would say this, you ought not to beat up someone for being gay. You ought not, it's wrong. It's not just not my preference, it's wrong. People on the conservative side would say, you ought not to kill your child in the womb, right? There is an actual ought not to, right? We all recognize that there is such a thing as ought not. Though on some issues are very clear, like torturing children for fun. Some things are less clear, like things like whether drinking at all is okay or not okay. Our inability to see some things does not negate, number one, our ability to see other things, but as well as, even if we can't see it, the fact that those things still exist. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So, any other questions? Any pushback? You know, if you had someone who disagrees with this at school and everything, what would you think they would say? You want to be prepared. What do you guys think? Anything.
Jeremy. Yes,
But
sorry.
if, like, even though we, like, gave him everything, but he just keeps on saying no.
Yeah.
Like, just, it's, not happening.
Good question. Like not admitting that there was such a thing as right and wrong, or not admitting that right and wrong will lead to God?
Yeah.
That one? So I've seen this in both cases where someone just refuses, despite the fact that it's obvious that torturing babies for fun is evil and wrong, and doing evil things like that. They just won't admit there's such a thing as right or wrong. They're just like, you know what? Because I want to win this argument, I'm not going to admit that. I've seen it. But the fact of the matter is, even in those situations, the person who goes against the experience of every individual person across our world, across history, they have the burden of proof. Imagine this. Imagine if everyone here believes, how many of you guys believe that we exist? Like all of us exist, right? How many of you believe that none of us exist? Right? Suppose I said none of us exist, right? I'm going against the common experience of every single person in this room here. So who has to do the convincing?
All of us.
Me. If I'm going against the common experience of everyone, literally everyone, I have what's called the burden of proof. I am required to give a reason because a claim made without evidence can be thrown out without evidence. Now, sometimes people hold to irrational things. They see the logic and they refuse to accept it, not because it's not logical, but because they just don't like the conclusion. So what I would say is if you show them this stuff, just ask them, can you show me where I got it wrong? Where is the gap in reasoning here? Right? Just show me. Of course someone can say, well, I just don't want to believe it. Sure, you can believe that. You can do that. But you have to ask why. Is it, I just don't like the conclusion? Well, a lot of truths are things that we don't like. I don't like the idea of COVID that killed many people. I just don't like it. But guess what? It happened. I don't like the idea of cancer. But it's a reality. It's killed people in this church here. Us not liking a conclusion does not mean that that conclusion is not the case. And so, of course, we can be irrational. We can stick our heads in the sand and say, you know what, I just don't like this. La, 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 la. I don't want to think about it. If I don't think about it, it doesn't really matter. I'm not really going to consider this because I don't like the conclusion. Or that just didn't convince me. I'm not going to kind of dig into why it didn't convince me. It didn't convince me because it doesn't resonate with me. It doesn't fit with how I feel. You can do that. But you got to ask yourself why. You got to ask yourself where the logic fails. Because if the logic doesn't fail, then it's you who are wrong. Our feelings don't change reality. And I will say this. What?
Could I interject something real quick?
Please, feel free.
Back when, I don't know if you guys remember, several months ago when I was teaching and we talked through some things in Romans 1. So Jeremy, with some of that, we as believers just have to understand that if you keep logically pointing out things to someone, then they're still just like, no, I'm just not there. We have to remember Romans 1 says, professing to be wise, they became fools. And Romans 1 lays out logically how God's invisible attributes were known out in creation. You can see them everywhere. You know that God exists just by looking at creation. But then what did it lead to? It led to them worshiping the creation rather than the Creator. And why? Because their foolish hearts were darkened. So they are fools in the sense that they cannot comprehend that. Some of that is because of wickedness. Some of it is just their choice that they're not going to do it. We have to accept as believers, though, that when they are in the unbelieving camp, though, that's who they are still, is that Romans 1 person. So we can do the best we can at the end of the day to logically explain all these things, and we should. We should be prepared to defend why we believe what we believe. I say even outside of the Bible. There's, to a certain point, only the Bible is the answer that we have to look at. But outside of the Bible, these logical things that Trent's going through, we need to be able to understand these things. But at the end of the day, we also have to understand we have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit who has opened our blinded eyes to see that all these things logically point to the existence of a God, and a God who desires to have a relationship with us. And the unbelieving person is still not in that camp yet. They are still blinded. There's a spiritual aspect to all of this stuff that we can logically do the best we can, but there's still that spiritual aspect of it that if it's not there, they're just not going to be there. And we have to be okay with that because we are not the ones responsible for their salvation. God is. We're responsible to be good followers of Christ and to point everyone we can to Him. But at the end of the day, He's the one responsible to make this connection between this logical, between look everywhere around and see that it points to me. he's the one responsible to get them to that point.
Yeah. Thank you, Joel. I appreciate that. Yeah, and that's important, guys, to keep in mind here. I remember I had a conversation with a friend of mine. So I grew up at a pretty good-sized church and everything, and there's quite a few of us who believed that we were going to go into ministry. And one guy's like, hey, I'm called to be a senior pastor. It's going to be great. I'm really, really want to do this. Years. He's like, I'm called to be a pastor. I go to Bible college. I come back. He's like, I'm an atheist. I'm like, what happened here? What's going on? So I'm like, hey, let's go out to lunch. I go out to lunch with him, and we have a 2.5-hour conversation. And he's asking me every single apologetic question, every single question about why we believe under the sun. Everything from how can we know there's even a God, to right and wrong, to how do we know Jesus was real, to did he really die on the cross, did he really resurrect from the dead, is that even possible with miracles, and how do we know the Bible's actually been copied right, how do we know it was reliable when it was first there, all the questions. Problem of evil, suffering, everything from predestination, all the stuff. And we go through every single one. At the very end of it, he's got no more questions left. And I asked him, I say, have I answered all your questions? He goes, yeah. So you can see that Christianity is true, it's rational. He's like, yeah. I'm like, let me ask you this, why aren't you on your knees before God and repenting? He goes, I don't know. I said, can I ask you a personal question? He goes, sure. I'm like, could it be that there's some sin that you don't want to give up in your life? You're living with your girlfriend, and you know you shouldn't. He kind of looks down, he looks up at me and says, you got me. I asked him, I said, can I ask you another question? If I would have asked you that at this 2.5 hours ago in the beginning of this conversation, what would you have said? He said, I would have said that you weren't able to answer my questions and that Christianity was stupid. You see, oftentimes the reason people reject Christianity is not because of the evidence, but it's because of something in their life, some sin, some hurt, because of the way the church treated them or some friend they knew. Some reality of, if I accept this, I'd have to give up my friend group. Guys, this is huge. It's all of my friends have beliefs that are not compatible with Christianity. We call Christians transphobic, homophobic, hypocritical, just bad people. If I become that, I won't have friends. Or a Muslim. If I believe that, living in a Muslim country, I will get kicked out of my family and maybe even killed. And so I won't consider this. When we use apologetics, when we use giving reasons for what we believe here, sometimes, many times, it's not a logical issue that's going on in the heart. But hear this is very important. So listen up, guys. Listen up here. Sometimes people who that's not their real issue have genuinely convinced themselves it is the real issue. The person the real reason they're not accepting it is because they're living with their significant other, has genuinely, they're not lying to you, they genuinely convince themselves the reason is because they don't think there's evidence for God. And so the way you can love them most is to meet them where they're at, give them evidence for God, and then point out, hey, you're still not a Christian. Let's figure that out why. You can't hide behind that anymore. We can dig into this together and work through it together. Understand, apologetics, that is giving reasons for Christianity, when done right, has a lot more overlap with counseling than it does with arguing. Because you're meeting them where they're at, you're answering the questions that they have, and you're explaining, this is why we believe these truths. This is why we should change. This is why we should think differently. This is why we should feel differently. This is why we should believe differently. So yes, what Joel's saying is true. Sometimes people are in a place where the heart issue it's a heart issue more than it is a mind issue, sometimes. Though there actually have been a few times I've seen people who they just don't believe these are true. God sends them someone to convince them, and through that, Holy Spirit works in their life. They're like, yes, I'm going to accept this. But oftentimes, because we're very emotional beings, it's all about these, what's going to happen if I accept this? I don't want to deal with the repercussions. Hear this here. I grew up in a Christian home. Some of you guys heard this if you were here like a month and a half ago when I first came here. I grew up in a Christian home. And I believed I was a Christian from very, very young. Very young. I was like, yeah, I'm a Christian. I grew up. And then when the gospel came up and they were saying things like, hey, if you haven't put your faith in Jesus, you're going to go to hell. Do you know what my response was to that? Don't think about it. Don't think about it. If I don't think, if I had to put it into words, the thought in my head was, if I don't think about it, it's not going to matter, it's not going to affect me. But here's the thing. I thought so little about it on purpose, I was avoiding it so much that I could not even conceive those words in my head. It was more like, ugh, without even verbalizing, I'm just not going to think about it. I call it hazy bias. Other people have called it automatic dismissiveness. I'm just going to dismiss it automatically without even thinking about it because it's scary to deal with that idea. It's scary. And yet, you know what the Bible says? To Christians, examine yourselves to see if you are in the faith. Examine yourselves. Look at yourselves. Think about it. Don't be afraid to look. The same would also be true about, listen, if this is the real world, if Christianity is true, then what's that mean about the world? The world reflects it. So if you study the world, it's going to point to Christianity, if it's really true. Just like if you study and you learn gravity because gravity's true. It's not some made-up stuff to make us feel better. These are real things. These are actual realities. So we don't have to be afraid. You don't have to be afraid of your doubts. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Okay.
I have a
Yes.
How do you know when to just let somebody go?
Great question.
When they're like,
Yeah.
they've said it and you just gotta let it go.
Here's what I would say. Different people need different things. You never want to force someone into a corner like a salesman. It's always good to think of your goal not as to get them from strongly opposed to Christianity to radical believer in the faith. Let your goal be to say, you know what, I'm going to put a little stone in your shoe. You guys ever have that happen when like you're walking on the road and you got something in your feet and between your sock and your shoe, or even your sock is the worst, and you're just like, ugh. What do you have to do in that situation? Do you just ignore it?
I sit down and take my shoe off.
You sit down, you take your shoe off, and you address it. What we're trying to do with people is say, hey, listen, I'm just going to give you a food for thought, give you a little thing to think about here. And if you bite, then we can talk more. We can talk more. Sometimes with people, if a person is angry, if a person is not willing to have any conversation or whatever in that moment, then for that moment, just say, you know what? I can see that me having this conversation is not going to bring this forward. Just drop it. So to answer your question directly, if the conversation isn't going forward and stopping the conversation would be better for their benefit for the time being, that would be the time you do. But I will say this, someone might not be ready in one moment, a week later they may be ready.
There's a wasp.
Wasp, yeah. Those things do go to hell, for sure. Yes.
I would also say, like you can't lose your salvation, because if you could, no one would be in heaven.
Yeah, and I agree with you. There is a disagreement among believers about whether you can or can't lose your salvation. But I think what Kathy is asking here is more like someone who isn't a Christian yet, you're trying to share with them. How do you know when to stop having that conversation? Is kind of where she's going. Does that make sense? And really, it's case by case, but really it comes down to, does this seem to be productive right now? Are they getting more angry because of this conversation? Generally speaking, people don't change their mind when they're angry, right? It was not going to get you guys, don't worry about it. Focus. Generally speaking, people are not going to change their mind when they're angry. By the way, here's a good tool for you guys to keep this in mind here. Good tool. If either person gets angry in the conversation, you lose. If you get angry, they're not going to take you seriously. If they get angry, they're not going to take you seriously.
If you get angry, they'll say, well, I won the argument.
The goal in these conversations, just ignore it, guys. It'll be fine. It's not going to attack you guys. The goal in a conversation, if it's to convince them, it's not to just destroy them and dominate with facts and logic. Like, no, listen, you're trying to convince them, you're trying to help them. If they're upset and angry, it's not going to help. All right. Any other questions before we get into flux capacitor? Yes.
So if we had to let him go, when do we know it's the right time to go back to the process?
Honestly, I think a lot of that is skill, and skill is learned through practice. Practice, practice, practice. You've heard that phrase, practice makes perfect. It's not exactly the case, it's more practice makes better. So one thing I have found, and we'll talk about this later on when we talk about personal evangelism and skills and how to do that well, but generally speaking, the tactic that Jesus implied the most was asking really good questions. So, you know what I talked about earlier, how this can be used in pretty much any conversation? Watch out for when someone makes claims, makes stands in the ground, and just ask them why. They're like, hey, listen, they're like, I think it's so horrible what Trump is doing to these undocumented, they say that. Whether you agree or disagree, maybe you agree, maybe you don't, it doesn't matter in this situation. Say, okay, interesting. Can you help me understand why that's the case? I want to understand more about what you believe here. Why do you think that's so messed up? Well, because this, and this. Can I ask you a question? Where do you think right and wrong come from? Notice, this had nothing to do with God. Now you're getting into that territory. Right? Right and wrong, we can't escape it. The only time, I've noticed this, the only time people deny right and wrong is when they smell what you're getting at, that it requires God to exist, and so then they ignore, then they suddenly, they're like, oh, there's no such thing as right and wrong. I mean, you can sure hurt trans people. It doesn't matter if you shoot a homeless, I mean, it just might not be my preference. But if you're not in that conversation, if their guard's not out, they're gonna be like, yeah, that's wrong, right? Why? Not because they care about truth, but because they don't want to come to a conclusion. Right? And what we can do as kind people trying to share truth is not point that out in an effort to own them, but to recognize that and say, okay, how can I help them to see the truth? Does that make sense? Any other questions before we get to the next thing? All right, so just as a recap here, we've gone over the cosmological argument for God's existence a few weeks ago. That is, we know God exists from the beginning of the universe. This week we went over the moral argument for God's existence. That is, we know God exists because of right obligations, right and wrong. These are only a tiny little sample of all the many arguments for God's existence. This is what it's talking about. In Psalm 19, it says, the heavens declare the glory of God. In Romans 1, when it talks about these things have been made plain to us. And yet we still often reject God. But we need to understand, friends, this is reality here. This isn't just some made up stuff to make us feel better. This is reality. It's complex. Makes us think really hard, but it is reality. So we have to ask ourselves, not, will I accept this? But the question we have to ask, what will I do with this reality? Just think in your head, what will I do with this reality? Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for making your existence known to us. Help us to reckon with this fact well, to internalize ways of sharing this with others, and to respond to you in a way that is fitting for you being our Creator that has had such great mercy and kindness to us. We love you, Lord. Help us to love you better, to serve you well, and to share the truth of what you have declared for us, for all people. Help us this week. We ask you in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, you guys are dismissed.